Welcome back to our study of the Bible book by book. Today we're going to do an introduction to the book of Leviticus. Many of you probably don't like the book of Leviticus. I dare say that it has caused more people to quit reading the Bible than any other book. It is difficult with laws and customs that we don't completely understand. We read the book and there are a lot of things like, how do you perform a sacrifice? The minutia of what to do, but we're never told why. And there's no why do you give this particular offering, this particular sacrifice. The Israelites just knew to do those sacrifices. They were part of the custom. And so God said, since you are going to do this, since you are going to act in this way, here's how to do it. Which makes it confusing. It makes it somewhat difficult to read these strange customs like do not wear shirts that are made of two different materials. In other words, no cotton poly blends whatsoever. Do not sow your fields with two different kinds of seeds. That's common practice now today. You'll see many farmers will overseed. Even if it looks like there's one uniform crop, there's usually some overseeding going on to help maintain the soil. In other words, we don't follow these kinds of customs. Much of Leviticus is completely ignored by both Jews and Christians today as far as having real legal impact on our lives. And so that makes it somewhat difficult to understand and to study. What is the point of Leviticus? What is its purpose in the Bible? And how do we live out what we are supposed to get from this book? These are the kinds of questions that plague us as we open up the book of Leviticus. The first thing we have to remember is that Leviticus comes on the heels of Exodus. Specifically, Leviticus comes right after God has made covenant with the people. And so we are supposed to read this as God telling Israel how to live in community with one another and to worship appropriately so they can truly be called God's people. The book of Leviticus revolves around one central idea. Leviticus 11:45, be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. Now, we often think of holiness as morally righteous of some sort, but in its root form, holiness means separated, distinct. In other words, you can tell a difference between one group and another. Israel was to be holy, that is, they were to be separated or distinct for a specific purpose, and that is to serve God. That doesn't mean that, well, we should look at it this way. Not all of the clean versus unclean was bad and good. Not all of the laws in Leviticus are about being right or wrong, righteous or unrighteous, good or evil. Some of them are simply about being distinct from the culture around them, because that's what it meant to be holy. Why did they want to be distinct? So that the people around them could clearly see they were God's chosen people and that they were different and that their lives reflected a different lifestyle. Why was the pig unclean? Well, there's lots of people who try to give you reasons, but it might simply be as simple as other cultures. That was a main staple of both their diet and their religious festivals. Why was the pig unclean? Possibly because every other religion used the pig so frequently, every other culture used it so frequently, that, hey, we're going to be distinct and not use it at all. So everybody will be able to tell us apart. There's at least some of that in Leviticus that we have to consider, that we have to take into account. Some of it is not about right and wrong. Some of it is about living a lifestyle being distinct. Now, some of it is about right and wrong. And this is where it gets tricky, because for many of us, it's hard to pin down exactly where one line is and the other one begins. It's hard to pin down. Some of it is right and wrong, because another big element of Leviticus is, as Jesus quotes it from Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. So a lot of these commands are about right and wrong, so that Israel can live together in harmony. That's kind of a basic overview. The book of Leviticus starts with these commands to sacrifice. And you're going to notice that what we see in Leviticus is first commands to sacrifice. So corporate worship, or individual worship in a corporate setting. Some elements of corporate worship. Then we get to the priests. This is how the priests are supposed to dress and act and carry themselves. This is how you're going to know an Israelite priest, so that you have someone to lead you in worship. And then, right on the heels of that, Aaron and his sons are commissioned as priests. And so you have right away, okay, this is how we are going to worship as the people of God. Then you have, here's the role of the priest for worship. And then you have God now saying, okay, let's make our priests. So you can see this progression of worship into responsibility. And that's kind of a theme for God, taking worship into responsibilities. Right after that, there's these laws about purity, clean versus unclean. And again, these are ceremonial clean, being ceremonially clean. In other words, in a proper state to worship. This does not mean that you were sinful. It does not mean that the people who were unclean were in any way less than somebody else. It just means that they were not in a fit condition to come worship. Because, again, this people is going to represent God, and so they should represent in their dress, in their appearance, in their hygiene, in their health, true purity. Now, some might argue that that is somewhat inappropriate, and there are some legitimate concerns to the way that the purity is stressed, but at the same time, it is meant to symbolize God's purity makes us pure. And so we don't allow the impurities of blood and death to contaminate God's space. God's space is to be sacred, is to be set apart for communion with God. And that is, we are to see that is vitally important to both who God is and who the people are. So we today should learn from that and say, well, how important is my reflection of God's purity? Is my reflection, my ability to reflect God's purity, vitally important to God? And if so, is it important to me? And that's something we can learn from these Levitical laws. We can learn that just like men and women were not supposed to enter the sanctuary with blood, when they were bleeding, hemorrhaging in some way, because that represented death, the antithesis of God, God who is life. Your blood leaving you represents death. Can you take death into God's presence? Well, no. we are supposed to be people of life. And it's symbolic of who the people was meant to represent. I know that doesn't cover nearly all of it, but that's at least why those purity laws are established in Leviticus. And yes, there are some that just boggle our minds today. And there are some that scholars argue over. But for the most part, that's kind of where they take us. And then this first half, kind of the first half of the book, concludes with the Day of Atonement and this great ceremony of cleansing, where the people take all of their sins and they remove them from the camp. Everything, all the sin is symbolically laid on this goat, and it is sent out into the wilderness. In some later rabbinic traditions, the goat was meant to be driven off of a cliff so that it would fall to its death. This way, the goat could not re-enter the community, bringing the sin back into the people. But the goat was to be taken away, and everything was cleansed. The tabernacle, God's dwelling place, got its, well, it wouldn't be spring cleaning. I guess it would be fall cleaning. The people were to clean themselves, and they were symbolically to remove all of the filth from their personal lives as well as from their community. And that sin was dealt with and expunged from the community so that they could be true representatives of who God is. I know that some traditions of the church say that Judaism has no way of dealing with sin, and that's not entirely accurate. While we in the church can certainly say we have a better understanding of how sin is dealt with, and we can certainly say that ours is probably a much more complete and rounded picture of sin. We cannot say that there is no forgiveness of sin in the Old Testament, because that is part of what the Day of Atonement is all about. So as we're reading this, we should be kind of thankful, but we should also thankful that we're not part of this system in some ways, but we should also recognize and marvel in the glory that is the Day of Atonement, because this is part of our heritage. Whether we physically celebrate it every year or not, this is part of our theological tradition. It is part of our theology, and it's part of our heritage. But that's how the first half of Leviticus kind of closes out. It closes out on the Day of Atonement. So we've gotten all of the sacrifices. This is how you give a sacrifice. And then here's what the priests are doing. Here's who they are. Here's kind of some cleanliness codes. And then here is, lastly, in the first half, how to expunge sin from the community. Now, the second half of the book picks up with some more details about how to sacrifice and when and all of this. It's really these, almost looks like odds and ends of little laws about what to do with the meat, proper sexual relations. These are the kinds of things that this is that section that most people really shake their heads at. It's really strange to our ears to hear some of this. Especially when we get into the ideas for sexuality and relationships. That's just somewhat odd and off-putting to us. But these relationships are all about building up a community. How do you keep from breaking down community? How do you build up community? And that's going to become kind of the hallmark of chapters 19 and 20, where community, social holiness, how to live together as one people, as one nation, takes center stage. That's where we see the great verse of love your neighbor as yourself. The idea that we are not supposed to be just individuals who live near each other, but we are supposed to be a bonded community who look out for and care for one another in our times of hurt and our times of distress. We then get more rules about the priests and the sacrifices. There is kind of a real structure to all this. It looks a little hodgepodge from where I sit and probably from where you sit, but I've read enough scholars to know that there's some real texture to this, and there's a symmetry to the way this book is constructed that I don't completely understand it, but I don't have to. And then the book closes out. Really, it kind of closes out with the idea of Sabbath. So, just like the first half of the book closes out with the Day of Atonement, the second half of the book, and the book in general, closes out with Sabbath, which, given how much space is dedicated to Sabbath rest, we should really take this seriously. We should read this section in chapter 25 and following on how to and why to allow the land to rest and the community to rest and the animals to rest. We've been saying it from the beginning, from the first part of Genesis, that God wants us to rest. God wants us to have time, sacred time, where we leave the 9-to-5 world, the business world, the world of accumulating goods. God wants us to leave that and to periodically take time to act as though we are living in the Garden of Eden, living on God's provision. A time to play, a time to sing, a time to worship, a time to, yes, even in some ways, work. The word that is translated worship in the book of Revelation is a word that means to do the manual service required for worship. So what it means is, when we translate worship in Revelation, and Revelation is all about resting in God, that word that is translated worship really is defined by the role of the priest in sacrifice. Now, what is the role of the priest in sacrifice? To kill the animal, to butcher the animal, to burn the animal, to give the portions to the people, to cook the animal. That's a lot of work. But that is considered worship and rest, not labor. Why? Because all of the energy is being put into building the community. So Sabbath is all about putting all of your energy into worshiping God and building community. Taking that day apart to recover, to see the joy in the world, and to build up the community and to build up your relationships with God. That's why Sabbath becomes this huge theme at the end of the book of Leviticus. We've talked about worship, we've talked about living together in harmony, and now that we have both of those established and everything that we can do for those, let's talk about how to put them together in a time of Sabbath. And we see that there's supposed to be a time of Sabbath every week, so that you're getting Sabbath day every week. You're going to get Sabbath rest every 7 years for an entire year. And then we're not exactly sure how this worked, but at least probably 2 years of Sabbath every 50 years. And here you're supposed to help the poor, redeem your brothers and sisters. That means that honestly, redeeming there means restore financial equity. That means every 50 years we're to wipe the slates clean, and pretty much everyone starts at the same level of income. I think that Andrew Carnegie would find that good. He did not like inherited wealth. But that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to help brothers and sisters in need. We are supposed to free slaves and all of those who are oppressed by our economy. That's what Sabbath rest is all about. And that is, while these are prescriptions for the Israelite culture, and we probably shouldn't legislate every 50 years this happens, these are the kinds of guidelines that are supposed to just govern Christians naturally. In other words, the church is supposed to be a community that never lets our community, our society, get to the place where freeing slaves and helping the economically oppressed is necessary. We should be a people that lives this out so well every day that a Sabbath year is just a big party. It's not about restoring people. It's just about living. That is what this whole section's about. And that's kind of a basic overview of Leviticus. I hope you found that helpful. I know that as you read the book, you're probably going to find a bunch of questions, a bunch of comments, a lot of things you want to work through. As always, if you find questions, specifically ones, if you find questions, just put a comment in the comment section or send a message to the church, and we will answer that as best we can. If I can, I'll try to make another video on whatever questions you have. I'm getting to the place where I kind of like these. So I hope that this is a blessing to you as you read Leviticus. And until we see each other again at Numbers, God bless.